He stared at the screen for 6 full seconds before the blood drained from his face. The message wasn't meant for her. It was meant for his brother. A rambling, half-drunk confession about how his billionaire boss made him feel things he hadn't felt since his wife died. Every word raw, every word true. And every word now sitting in Vanessa Laurent's private inbox, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., already marked as read. Ethan Walker had just destroyed the only job keeping his daughter fed. Or so he thought. Because what happened next didn't just save his career, it cracked open 2 lives that had been sealed shut by grief and fear. If you want to see how one terrible mistake became the greatest love story neither of them expected, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels, and let's begin. The alarm on Ethan Walker's phone went off at 5:15 in the morning, same as every other weekday. And he lay there in the gray dark of his bedroom, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that had been growing since October. He should have called the landlord about it 2 months ago. He should have done a lot of things 2 months ago. The phone buzzed again. The backup alarm he'd set because the first one had stopped waking him reliably sometime around the anniversary of Claire's death, and he reached over and silenced it without looking. From the other side of the thin wall, he could hear Ava's breathing. Not snoring exactly, but that heavy, whistling exhale she made when she slept hard, the sound that used to make Claire laugh and press her ear against the nursery wall just to listen. He lay there another 30 seconds, letting that sound do what caffeine couldn't, and then he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as the dining room, if you pushed the microwave to the edge of the counter and squeezed a folding table against the wall. They'd moved here 18 months ago after the house became too expensive to keep. The house where Ava had taken her first steps, where Claire had planted a row of hydrangeas along the fence that probably nobody watered anymore. Ethan didn't drive past it. He took the long way to work specifically so he wouldn't have to see the new family's minivan in the driveway. He brushed his teeth, avoided the mirror out of habit, and pulled on the nicest pair of jeans he owned. Today mattered. Today was his first day at Laurent Media Group, and the paycheck attached to this job was the difference between keeping Ava in her school district and pulling her out mid-year again. He couldn't do that to her. Not after last time, when she'd come home with her backpack straps twisted tight in her fists and told him she didn't make any friends yet. But it was fine, because she was used to it. 9 years old and already used to things not working out. That sentence had kept him awake for 3 straight nights. He made her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, the off-brand cheese crackers she liked because the box had a cartoon fox on it, and left it on the counter with a sticky note that said, "Have the best day, I love you more than pizza." It was their thing. Claire had started it when Ava was 4, writing little notes on napkins and hiding them in her lunchbox. And after Claire died, Ethan had picked it up without discussion. He wasn't as funny as Claire had been. His handwriting was worse. But Ava still peeled the notes off carefully and stuck them to the wall beside her bed, and that wall was getting pretty full, and that was enough. His brother Marcus called while Ethan was standing at the bus stop. "First day jitters?" Marcus said. His voice had that careful lightness to it, the one he'd been using since the funeral, like he was afraid anything heavier might break something that couldn't be fixed. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're standing at a bus stop at 5:40 in the morning, about to go work for a woman Forbes called the most intimidating CEO under 40. You're allowed to be nervous." "I'm not nervous. I need this to work, Mark. That's all." "It's going to work. You're a hell of a designer." "I'm an okay designer who's been freelancing out of his kitchen for 2 years. This is a corporate office, glass walls and espresso machines, and people who went to schools I can't pronounce." "Ethan." "What?" "Shut up and get on the bus." He almost smiled. Almost. The bus pulled up, and he climbed on, found a seat near the back, and watched Cleveland scroll past the window. The boarded-up storefronts on Euclid, the coffee shop where he and Claire had their first date, the hospital where she'd spent her last 11 days. The city was a minefield of memories, and he'd learned to navigate it the way soldiers learn to walk through actual minefields. Eyes forward, don't stop, don't think too hard about what's under your feet. Laurent Media Group occupied the top 6 floors of a building downtown that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed glass and steel could have feelings. The lobby alone was bigger than Ethan's apartment, twice. He stood just inside the revolving door for a moment, holding his portfolio bag against his chest like a shield, watching people in tailored clothes move through the space with the kind of confidence that came from never having worried about whether their debit card would clear at the grocery store. A woman at the front desk smiled at him. "Can I help you?" "Ethan Walker, I'm starting today. Design department." She typed something, nodded, and handed him a visitor badge. "Someone from HR will be down in a few minutes. You can wait over there." He sat on a leather chair that was probably worth more than his car and tried not to look like he was drowning. The HR orientation took 2 hours. He signed forms, got a real badge, received a laptop that weighed almost nothing, and was walked through the building by a woman named Priya, who talked fast and smiled often and seemed genuinely happy to work there, which surprised him. He'd read the articles. Vanessa Laurent ran a tight ship. The company had tripled its revenue in 4 years under her leadership, but the turnover rate in senior positions was brutal. People either thrived under her standards or they crumbled. There was no middle ground. "You'll be on the 17th floor," Priya said, leading him through a corridor lined with framed magazine covers, all featuring Laurent media properties. "Creative team. Your direct supervisor is Daniel Okafor. He's great, tough but fair. You'll like him." "And Miss Laurent?" Priya glanced at him. "What about her? Does she interact with the design team directly, or—" "Vanessa's involved in everything." Priya said it like a fact, not a complaint. "She reviews major creative decisions personally. You probably won't interact with her one-on-one unless you're on a flagship project, but she sees everything that goes out the door. Everything." She dropped him at his desk, a clean, modern workstation near a window that overlooked the river, and wished him luck. He sat down, opened the laptop, and spent the next 10 minutes pretending to read the employee handbook while his heart hammered against his ribs. By noon, he'd met his team. Daniel was exactly as Priya described, a tall, serious man in his 40s with a dry sense of humor and an eye for detail that bordered on surgical. The other designers were younger than Ethan, mostly, and they had the easy confidence of people who'd never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. He didn't resent them for it. He just noticed it the way you notice a language you don't speak, the fluency of people who'd never been desperate. He ate lunch alone in the break room, texted Ava's after-school program to confirm pickup time, and checked his bank account. The signing bonus had hit that morning. He stared at the number for a long time. It wasn't life-changing money by most standards, but it meant he could pay off the credit card he'd been carrying since Claire's medical bills, and maybe, take Ava to the science museum she'd been asking about for months. He put the phone away and got back to work. The first week passed in a blur of deadlines, software onboarding, and trying to learn the unwritten rules of a company that operated at a speed he wasn't used to. Everything at Laurent Media moved fast. Concepts were pitched on Monday, revised by Wednesday, and either approved or killed by Friday. There was no room for hesitation. Daniel told him on his third day that Vanessa had a rule. "Don't bring me a problem unless you've already brought yourself 3 solutions." "She actually said that?" Ethan asked. "She says a lot of things," Daniel replied, not looking up from his screen. "Most of them are right." Ethan didn't see Vanessa in person until his second week. He was in the hallway outside the main conference room, waiting for a meeting that had been pushed back twice, when the elevator opened and she came through. He'd seen photos, of course. Everyone had. The magazine covers, the interviews, the charity galas. But photos didn't capture the way she moved. The wheelchair wasn't an afterthought or an accommodation. It was part of her the way a crown is part of a queen. Not because it made her regal, but because she wore it like she'd decided a long time ago that it would never define her, and anyone who thought otherwise could get out of the way. She was wearing a dark blazer, no jewelry except a thin gold chain, and her expression was the kind of neutral that suggested she was thinking about 4 things at once, and none of them were small. 2 people flanked her, assistants maybe, or executives, Ethan couldn't tell, and they were talking quickly, presenting numbers, citing client names. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp, her hands still in her lap. When they finished, she said something quiet that Ethan couldn't hear, and both of them nodded and walked away in different directions like they'd just been given orders. She looked up as she passed him. Their eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him with a directness that made him feel like she'd read his entire resume in the time it took to blink. Then she was gone, rolling into the conference room, and the door closed behind her. "That's her," someone behind him whispered, like Ethan needed the clarification. He found himself thinking about that 2-second look for the rest of the day. Not because it was intense or flirtatious. It wasn't. It was something else. Something he couldn't name. Like she'd seen him and actually registered that he was a person, not a body standing in a hallway. In his experience, people that powerful didn't bother looking at people that insignificant, but she had looked. And he couldn't stop wondering what she'd seen. 3 weeks in, Ethan was assigned to a rebranding project for one of Laurent Media's flagship digital platforms. It was a high-profile job, the kind that would either make his reputation at the company or end it. Daniel gave him the brief on a Friday afternoon and told him the first round of concepts was due the following Thursday. "Vanessa's reviewing these personally," Daniel added, watching Ethan's face. "Don't panic, just do good work." "I'm not panicking. You're holding your pen so tight it's about to snap." Ethan looked down. He was. He set it on the desk and flexed his fingers. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He spent the weekend working at the kitchen table after Ava went to bed, sketching concepts on paper before moving to the computer, scrapping everything twice, starting over from nothing at 2 a.m. on Saturday while the apartment creaked around him and the water stain on the bedroom ceiling probably grew another half-inch. Ava found him asleep at the table Sunday morning, his cheek pressed against a printout, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. "Dad," she poked his shoulder. "Dad, you're drooling on your work." He sat up, wiped his mouth, and looked at her. She was wearing the pajamas with the little rockets on them, her dark hair tangled from sleep, and she was holding a bowl of cereal she'd poured herself because she'd learned 2 years ago that sometimes Dad wasn't awake when she needed breakfast. "Sorry, Bug." "It's okay. Can we go to the park today?" He looked at the spread of papers and sketches and the laptop screen still glowing with half-finished layouts. He thought about the Thursday deadline. He thought about the mortgage-sized gap in his bank account. He thought about Vanessa Laurent reviewing his work personally and deciding whether he was worth keeping. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go to the park." They spent 3 hours at Edgewater Park. Ava collected rocks she called specimens and arranged them by color on a bench while Ethan sat next to her and pretended he wasn't thinking about typography and brand architecture. She told him about a girl at school named Lily who had a pet hamster that could run through a maze, and about how her teacher said she was exceptionally creative, and about how she wished she could learn to play the guitar because she heard a song on the radio that made her feel like flying. "What song?" he asked. "I don't know the name. It went like this." She hummed something tuneless and beautiful and not remotely recognizable. And he laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and catches you off guard. And she grinned at him with Claire's smile, and he had to look away for a second because the joy and the grief hit him at the exact same time, the way they always did, tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them anymore. He submitted the concepts on Wednesday, a day early. Daniel reviewed them, made 2 small notes, and passed them up the chain. Thursday came and went. Friday morning, Ethan got an email from an address he didn't recognize. "Mr. Walker, your concepts for the Meridian rebrand are strong. The second direction has potential but needs refinement in the color system. I'd like to see a revised version by Monday. Keep pushing. VL." He read it 4 times, then he forwarded it to Marcus with no message, and Marcus called him 30 seconds later. "VL? That's her? She emailed you directly?" "Apparently." "Ethan, the CEO of a billion-dollar company just told you your work is strong, in writing. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I have to work this weekend." "It means you're good enough to be there. Stop acting like you snuck in through a window." He worked that weekend too. Ava poured her own cereal again on Sunday, but this time she brought a bowl to his desk and set it down without a word. And when he looked up, she was already back on the couch reading a book about ocean creatures, her feet tucked under a blanket, perfectly content in the way that children are when they've decided their parent is busy but still present, and that's close enough to okay. Monday, he submitted the revision. Tuesday, Daniel called him into his office. "She approved it," Daniel said. "Vanessa approved the second direction with your revisions. No further notes." Ethan didn't know what to say. His throat felt tight. That almost never happens, Daniel added. She always has notes. She had no notes. Over the next several weeks, Ethan settled into a rhythm that was exhausting but functional. He dropped Ava at school by 7:30, caught the bus downtown, worked until 6 or sometimes 7, picked Ava up from the after-school program, made dinner, helped with homework, put her to bed, and then worked more. The apartment was messy. The laundry piled up. He forgot to buy milk 3 weeks in a row, and Ava started reminding him by putting an empty carton on his pillow. But the work was good. Better than good. He was producing the best designs of his career, and he could feel himself growing in ways he hadn't since the early years of his marriage, when Claire was alive and he had the emotional bandwidth to care about things like professional ambition and creative fulfillment. Those concepts had felt like luxuries for the past 3 years. Now they were coming back, slowly, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb for too long. He interacted with Vanessa more as the weeks passed, never one-on-one, always in meetings, presentations, group reviews. She was precise, demanding, occasionally cutting. He watched her dismantle a senior executive's proposal in 6 words once. This solves a problem nobody has. The room had gone silent. The executive had flushed red and gathered his papers and left, and Vanessa had moved on to the next item on the agenda without acknowledging the wreckage. But Ethan noticed something the others seemed to miss. After that meeting, he'd seen Vanessa stop in the hallway and say something to the executive, quietly, privately, away from the glass walls and watching eyes. The man had nodded, his shoulders dropping from somewhere near his ears back to something normal, and when he walked away, he didn't look humiliated anymore. He looked like someone who'd been told the truth by someone who meant it. She was hard, but she wasn't cruel. There was a difference, and most people didn't bother to see it. Late nights at the office became more common as a major product launch approached. Ethan was often one of the last people on the 17th floor, working by the light of his monitor while the cleaning crew moved silently through the building around him. One evening, around 9:30, he went to the break room to refill his coffee and found Vanessa there. She was by the window, her wheelchair positioned so she could see the city skyline, a tablet in her lap, a half-eaten sandwich on the counter beside her. She looked up when he came in. "Walker," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just his name, stated like a fact. "Ms. Laurent. Sorry. I didn't know anyone else was still here." "I'm always still here." She said it without self-pity. "Sit down. You've been staring at a screen for 12 hours. Your eyes look like someone rubbed sand in them." He hesitated. Then he sat. Not because she was his boss, but because she was right about his eyes. "The Meridian launch materials," she said. "Where are you?" 80%. I'm stuck on the motion graphics for the landing page. The transitions feel generic. Generic how? Like everyone else's. Like something you'd see on any tech company's website. It doesn't feel like Laurent." She was quiet for a moment, then, "What does Laurent feel like to you?" Nobody had ever asked him that. Not Daniel, not the other designers, not any of the executives who talked about brand identity in meetings using words like synergy and vertical integration that meant everything and nothing. "Controlled intensity," he said, surprising himself. Like a symphony conductor. Everything precise, everything deliberate. But underneath there's this energy that could go in any direction at any time. The audience doesn't see the chaos, they just feel the result. Vanessa looked at him. Not the 2-second corridor glance from his first week. A real look. Sustained. Evaluating. And something else. Something softer that flickered across her face so quickly he almost missed it. "That's exactly right," she said quietly. "Nobody's ever described it that way before." "I'm sure they have." They haven't. They use words like luxury and premium and cutting edge, which tells me nothing except that they've read the same marketing textbooks. You just told me what this company actually feels like. That's different. He didn't know what to do with the silence that followed, so he got up and poured his coffee and sat back down. And they talked for another 40 minutes about design and branding and the difference between making something beautiful and making something true. She was sharp and opinionated and occasionally wrong and willing to admit it, which was more than he could say for most people he'd worked with. He told her about a typeface he'd been obsessing over for a personal project, a hand-drawn serif that reminded him of old bookshop signage. And she told him about a photography exhibition she'd seen in Berlin that had changed the way she thought about negative space. At 10:15, her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, and her face shifted. A micro-expression of something that looked like disappointment, or maybe just tiredness. "My driver's here," she said. She straightened in her chair, and the corporate mask slid back into place so smoothly it was like watching a door close. "Good night, Walker. Fix those transitions." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. I'm 30 years old." "Sorry." "Good night, Ms. Laurent." "Vanessa," she said, already turning toward the elevator. "When it's after 9 and there's nobody else on the floor, you can call me Vanessa." He stood in the break room after she left, holding his coffee, staring at the spot where she'd been, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not attraction, exactly, though there was that too, buried under layers of guilt and practicality. It was recognition, the feeling of meeting someone who operated on the same frequency. Someone who cared about the difference between good and true, and who could tell when you did too. He went back to his desk and fixed the transitions in 40 minutes. They were the best work he'd ever done. The accidental text happened on a Thursday night, 3 months after he'd started at Laurent Media. It had been a brutal day. A client had rejected an entire campaign 24 hours before launch. Vanessa had called an emergency all-hands meeting that lasted until 8 p.m., and Ethan had missed Ava's bedtime for the 3rd time that week. His mother-in-law, Diane, had picked Ava up and was staying at the apartment. And when Ethan called to say goodnight, Ava's voice had been flat and small in a way that made his chest physically hurt. "It's okay, Dad. I know you're busy." Those words, coming from a 9-year-old. He'd sat in his car in the parking garage for 10 minutes after hanging up, gripping the steering wheel, breathing carefully, trying to hold together the fragile architecture of his life that seemed to develop new cracks every single day. Marcus texted him around 11. "How you holding up?" Ethan started typing. The words came fast, fueled by exhaustion and frustration, and something he hadn't acknowledged to himself until that moment. He typed for 3 minutes straight without stopping, a raw, unfiltered stream of consciousness that covered everything: the job, the pressure, the money, Ava's voice on the phone, and Vanessa. Especially Vanessa. "I've never met anyone like her, Mark. She's not what the articles say. She's not cold or calculating or any of that crap. She's the most perceptive person I've ever been in a room with. She sees everything, every detail, every weakness, every strength. And she doesn't pretend she doesn't. She challenged me on a concept yesterday, and she was right. And instead of feeling defensive, I felt grateful because nobody's pushed me like that since Claire used to look at my sketches and say, 'This is good, but it's not yours yet.' That's what Vanessa does. She makes you want to be better, and she doesn't apologize for it. And yeah, she's beautiful. That's not the point, but it's also not nothing. And I think about her more than I should, and I know this is insane because she's my boss, and she's worth more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes. But when we talk late at the office, it's the only time I feel like a complete person and not just a tired guy trying to keep his kid fed, and I don't know what to do with that." He hit send, and then he looked at the screen, and his entire body went cold. The message hadn't gone to Marcus. He'd tapped the wrong conversation thread. The message, every single humiliating, revealing, devastating word of it, had gone directly to Vanessa Laurent. He stared at the phone. He watched the message sit there in her chat window, delivered, unanswerable, catastrophic. He waited for the little indicator that would tell him she'd read it. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she wouldn't see it until morning, and he could, what, break into her phone, flee the country, invent time travel? The indicator changed. Read. 11:47 p.m. He dropped the phone on the passenger seat like it had burned him. Then he picked it up again and typed, "I am so sorry. That message was not meant for you. It was meant for my brother. I understand if this changes things. I understand if you need me to resign. I'm sorry." He sent it. This time to the right person, and also to Marcus, because his hands were shaking so badly, he figured he might as well cover all bases. Marcus called immediately. "Ethan, what happened?" I sent her a message, by accident, about her, about how Mark, I told her everything. Define everything. I told her she was beautiful. I told her she makes me feel like a complete person. I told her she reminds me of Claire. Silence. Then, okay, that's okay. Breathe. I can't breathe. I just destroyed my career with a text message. Ava's going to have to change schools again. We're going to lose the apartment. I finally had something stable and I... Stop. Just stop. Go home. Sleep if you can. You don't know what happens next. Nobody does. He drove home. He didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling, and the water stain stared back, and neither of them had any answers. The next morning, he dropped Ava at school and went to work fully expecting to be met by security. He'd packed his personal items from his desk into his bag the night before: a photo of Ava, a small succulent plant she'd given him for his birthday, 2 mechanical pencils he'd owned since college. The bag felt absurdly light for the sum total of a man's professional presence. Nothing happened. He got to his desk. His access badge worked. His computer logged in normally. No emails from HR. No summons to the executive floor. Daniel said, "Good morning." The day proceeded as if the previous night had been a fever dream. By 2 in the afternoon, Ethan had almost convinced himself that Vanessa had decided to simply ignore the message and pretend it never happened. A mercy killing, the corporate equivalent of looking away while someone picked themselves up off the floor. He could live with that. He could bury the embarrassment under work and time and never mention it again, and everything would be fine. At 2:17 p.m., his phone buzzed. "My office. Now. Come alone. VL." He stood up so fast he knocked his coffee over. Daniel looked at him from across the room but didn't say anything. Ethan grabbed a handful of napkins, cleaned up the spill with mechanical precision, and walked to the elevator. The executive floor was quiet. Vanessa's office was at the end of a wide corridor. Glass walls on 3 sides, a view of the lake that probably cost more per square foot than Ethan's annual rent. Her assistant, a young man named Julian, nodded at him and gestured toward the door. "She's expecting you." Ethan walked in. The door closed behind him. The click of the latch sounded enormous. Vanessa was behind her desk, her wheelchair positioned at an angle that put the window light behind her, which was either accidental or a power move, and he honestly couldn't tell. Her face was unreadable. She didn't speak. She just looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the corridor that first week. Direct, penetrating. The kind of gaze that made you feel like your entire life was printed on your forehead. "Miss Laurent, Sit down, Ethan." First name. She'd never used his first name. He sat. "I read your message," she said. "Obviously." "I know, and I want to say, I'm not finished." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was careful, the way someone speaks when they're handling something fragile. "I read your message, and I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without apologizing for the next 3 minutes. Can you do that?" He nodded. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, perfectly still. And when she looked up again, the corporate mask was gone. Not sliding, not cracking. Gone. Like she'd taken it off and set it on the desk between them. "Nobody talks about me the way you did in that message," she said. "I've been profiled in 47 magazines. I've been on 3 talk shows. I've had entire chapters written about me in business books. And not one of those people, not a single one, ever described me the way you did to your brother at 11 o'clock at night when you thought nobody would ever see it." She paused. Ethan said nothing. 3 minutes, she'd said. "They call me brilliant. They call me tough. They call me inspiring, which is the word people use when they don't know what to do with a woman in a wheelchair who's more successful than they are. But you said I make people want to be better. You said I see everything. You compared me to your wife, and from what I know about how much you loved her, that is not a comparison you make lightly." Her voice stayed steady. Her eyes didn't. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. I'm not going to fire you. I'm not going to report you to HR. I'm not going to pretend I didn't read that message, because pretending is something I stopped doing a long time ago, and I'm not going to start again for the sake of corporate protocol." She leaned forward slightly. "But I also need you to understand that this is complicated. I am your boss. You are my employee. The power dynamic here is real, and it matters, and I refuse to be a woman who ignores that. So whatever this is, whatever you feel, She stopped, regrouped. We need to be honest with each other, and we need to be careful. Can we agree on that? Yes, he said. It came out rough, like the word had been scraped over gravel. Good. She straightened. Now, your transitions on the Meridian landing page were excellent. Daniel submitted the final build this morning. I have no notes. He almost laughed. The whiplash from emotional devastation to professional feedback was so perfectly, absurdly her that he felt his chest unknot for the first time in 12 hours. Thank you, he said, for the work feedback, for not firing him, for taking the mask off, for all of it. She nodded once. Close the door on your way out. He stood. He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she spoke again. Ethan. He turned. For what it's worth, she said, and her voice was quieter now, stripped of authority, almost fragile. Nobody's made me feel seen in a very long time either. He walked back to his desk. He sat down. Daniel asked if everything was okay. Ethan said yes, and for the first time in 3 years, he meant it in a way that scared him. Because it was true, and because it was new, and because the last time he'd felt something this close to hope, it had ended in a hospital room with a woman he loved closing her eyes for the last time. He picked up his phone and texted Marcus. She didn't fire me. Marcus responded instantly. What happened? Ethan looked at the phone for a long time. Then he typed, I think something just started, and I have no idea what I'm doing. He put the phone in his desk drawer, opened his laptop, and went back to work. Because that's what he did. That's what he'd always done. You keep your head down and you keep moving forward and you don't stop, because stopping means thinking, and thinking means feeling, and feeling means acknowledging that your life just shifted on its axis in a way you didn't plan for and can't control. Outside the window, the sun was going down over Cleveland, turning the river to copper, and somewhere across the city his daughter was eating dinner at her grandmother's table, and somewhere above him a woman in a wheelchair was sitting in her glass office looking at the same sunset. And he didn't know what any of it meant yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. The weeks after that conversation in Vanessa's office moved differently. Not faster or slower, just differently, like the air pressure in the building had changed and only 2 people could feel it. Nothing happened immediately. That was the strange part. Ethan went back to his desk and kept working. Vanessa stayed on the executive floor and kept running her empire. They didn't text. They didn't exchange loaded glances across conference rooms. From the outside, nothing had changed at all, and Ethan told himself that was fine, that maybe the conversation had been a release valve and nothing more. 2 lonely people acknowledging something honest and then putting it away like adults. Except he couldn't put it away. And the evidence suggested she couldn't either. It started with the late nights. Ethan had always stayed late, the workload demanded it, and the empty apartment didn't exactly call him home. But now, when he wandered into the break room at 9 or 10 p.m., Vanessa was there more often than she wasn't. Not waiting for him exactly. But not surprised to see him either. They talked. About work at first, because work was safe. She asked about the Meridian campaign rollout. He asked about the quarterly board meeting she'd been preparing for. They debated typefaces and color theory, and whether minimalism in design had become a crutch that lazy creatives use to avoid taking real risks. You think every minimalist designer is lazy? She said one night, amused. I think some of them are scared. There's a difference between choosing simplicity and hiding behind it. And which one are you? I don't know yet. Ask me in 6 months. I will. She said it like a promise, and the way she held his gaze when she said it made his pulse do something unprofessional. The conversations got longer. They moved beyond work. She told him about the accident. Not the sanitized version from the magazines, but the real one. She'd been 23, driving home from a meeting in the rain, when a delivery truck ran a red light and hit her driver's side at 40 miles an hour. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later, couldn't feel her legs, and spent the next 8 months in rehab learning how to navigate a world that had suddenly become a series of obstacles. The worst part wasn't the chair, she said, staring out the break room window at the city lights. The worst part was watching people's faces change when they saw me in it. I went from being a young executive people were intimidated by to being a young executive people felt sorry for. Same brain, same ambition, same everything, but now they looked at me like I was half a person. That must have been infuriating. It was infuriating. Don't say it must have been hard. Everything's hard. Losing your wife was hard. Raising a child alone is hard. Difficulty isn't the point. The point is that people started defining me by the chair, and I had to spend the next 7 years proving that the chair was the least interesting thing about me. He didn't flinch at the mention of Claire. He noticed that Vanessa didn't soften her voice when she brought her up either. She spoke about his grief the same way she spoke about her own. Directly, without pity, the way you talk to someone you consider an equal. Did it work? He asked. Proving it? Professionally? Yes? Personally? She paused, and something shifted behind her eyes. Personally, I'm sitting in a break room at 10:30 at night talking to a man who works for me because he's the only person in this entire building who talks to me like I'm just a person. The silence that followed was thick with things neither of them said. He told Marcus about the conversations because he told Marcus everything, and because he needed someone to tell him he was being an idiot. Marcus, disappointingly, refused. "You're not an idiot," Marcus said over the phone. Ethan was sitting in his car in the parking garage, the engine running because the heater was broken and the Cleveland winter had arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "You're a human being connecting with another human being. That's what people do." "She's my boss, Mark." "I'm aware." "She's worth $3 billion. Also aware." "I make $67,000 a year and I drive a car with a broken heater." "Ethan, do you think she cares about your heater?" "I think the world will care. I think people will look at us and see a narrative. Poor widower targets rich, disabled CEO. You know how that plays." "Since when do you care how things play?" "Since I have a daughter who goes to school with kids whose parents read tabloids." That stopped Marcus. Ethan could hear him breathing, recalibrating, the way he always did when Ava entered the equation. Because Ava wasn't theoretical. Ava was a 9-year-old girl who'd already lost her mother and changed schools twice, and who deserved a life that didn't involve her father making headlines for the wrong reasons. "Okay," Marcus said finally. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know." "That's not good enough. You're the guy with the plan. You always have a plan." "My plan was to work hard, keep my head down, and not fall for my billionaire boss. I failed step 3. "You fell for her?" Ethan stared through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. A crack ran through it diagonally, splitting the gray into 2 uneven halves. He thought about how cracks started small and grew until one day the whole structure was compromised, and you either fixed it or you watched it come apart. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." The next late night, Vanessa wasn't in the break room. Ethan made his coffee, stood by the window for a few minutes, and went back to his desk feeling something that was embarrassingly close to disappointment. He was acting like a teenager. He was 32 years old, a father, a grown man with responsibilities, and a retirement account that had $1,100 in it. He didn't get to have butterflies. At 9:45, his laptop pinged with an internal message. 17th floor too quiet tonight. I'm on 22 if your coffee can travel. V. He took the elevator up. Her office was dark except for the desk lamp and the city glow through the windows. She was reviewing something on her tablet, reading glasses perched on her nose. He hadn't known she wore them. And she looked up when he knocked on the open door. "You wear glasses," he said. "Only for reading. Don't tell anyone. It undermines the mystique." He almost smiled. He sat in the chair across from her desk. The coffee was still hot. The office smelled faintly of something expensive. Not perfume. Maybe the lotion she used on her hands, which she rubbed together sometimes during meetings when she was thinking hard about something. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, setting the tablet down. "And I want an honest answer." "Okay." "When you wrote that message, the one meant for your brother, you said, 'I remind you of your wife.' What did you mean by that?" He'd been waiting for this question. He'd also been dreading it, because the answer required a level of honesty that felt like handing someone a knife and trusting them not to cut. "Claire pushed me," he said slowly, choosing each word like he was placing stones across a river. "Not aggressively, not like a drill sergeant. She just She had this ability to look at something I'd made and tell me the truth about it. Not what I wanted to hear, the truth. And it made me better. Every time. Even when it stung. He looked at Vanessa. She was watching him with complete attention, the way she watched presenters in meetings, except without the assessment. Just listening. You do the same thing, he said. Not just with me, with everyone. You see people clearly, and you tell them what you see, and most of them can't handle it, so they call you cold or intimidating, or whatever word makes them feel better about their own mediocrity. But it's not cold. It's the opposite. It's you care enough to be honest. Claire was like that. It's the thing I miss most about her. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. Then she took off her glasses and set them on the desk and pressed her fingertips against her closed eyelids, and he realized with a jolt that she was fighting back tears. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Her voice was thick but controlled. She dropped her hands and looked at him, and her eyes were bright and wet and fierce. Do you know how long it's been since someone told me that the thing people hate about me is actually the thing they should be grateful for? It shouldn't be that long, but it is. Because the people who get close to me, the ones who survive the first few months of working with me, dating me, whatever, they all eventually start asking me to soften, be less direct, smile more, let things slide. And I can't. I won't. So they leave and they tell their friends that Vanessa Laurent is too much, and then some magazine profiles me and calls me formidable, which is just code for a woman that men find inconvenient. Ethan felt a pulse of anger on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity. That's not what you are. You don't know what I am. We've been having break room conversations for 6 weeks. I know enough. You know the version of me that shows up at 10 p.m. when I'm tired and my guard is down. The daytime version is worse. She fires people and cancels contracts and makes decisions that cost someone their livelihood because the numbers demand it. Can you handle that version? I handle it every day. I work here. Working for me and being with me are two very different things. The word being hung between them. She'd said it. Not him. She'd put it out there, the implication that this was heading somewhere beyond late-night conversations and careful admissions, and now it was real in a way it hadn't been 5 seconds ago. I know they're different, he said. I know the power imbalance. I know the optics. I know every reason this is a bad idea. Do you want me to list them? I have my own list. It's longer than yours. Then maybe we should stop. She looked at him. Is that what you want? No, but I think it's what I should want. I have a kid, Vanessa. Everything I do affects her. If this goes wrong, you lose your job and your reputation, and I lose the one person in this building who doesn't treat me like a boardroom. We both lose. The question is whether the risk is worth it. And I don't know yet. She picked up her glasses, turned them over in her hands, put them back on. But I'm not going to pretend I haven't been thinking about it. That would be dishonest, and I told you, I stopped pretending. He left her office at 11. In the elevator, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes and pressed his hands flat against the cold metal railing and tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent. He couldn't. His thoughts were a pile of loose wire. Claire and Ava and Vanessa and money and fear and desire and the look on Vanessa's face when she'd said, the one person in this building who doesn't treat me like a boardroom. That look, like she'd been starving and he'd accidentally shown her food. The next morning, everything changed. Ethan was at his desk when the elevator opened and a man stepped onto the 17th floor who didn't belong there. He was tall, impeccably dressed, mid-30s, with the kind of jawline that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed God had gotten lazy with everyone else's face. He moved through the office like he owned it, not in the way Vanessa owned it, with earned authority and operational knowledge, but in the way of someone who believed expensive shoes entitled him to any room he entered. Daniel looked up from his screen. Adrian, he said, and the single word carried enough weight to stop 3 people in the hallway. The man, Adrian, smiled. It was the kind of smile that had teeth behind it. Daniel, good to see you. She in? 22nd floor. You should probably call ahead. Since when do I call ahead? He walked to the elevator without waiting for an answer. The floor was silent for several seconds after he left. Who was that? Ethan asked. Daniel took a moment. Adrian Vale, former CFO, former other things. He paused in a way that communicated everything without saying it. He left the company 2 years ago, or Vanessa pushed him out. Depends on who you ask. Other things meaning he and Vanessa were together for about a year before it fell apart. Badly. He comes back every few months when he wants something, money, attention, a chance to prove he still matters. She tolerates it because he's still connected to half the investors on the board. Ethan's stomach dropped. Not because of jealousy. He didn't have the standing to be jealous, but because the picture had just gotten bigger and more complicated in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was history here, politics, a web of money and power and personal wreckage that he was walking into blind. He didn't see Adrian again that day, but he heard about the meeting. Everyone heard about the meeting. Vanessa's assistant Julian told Priya, who told a senior designer, who told the entire floor by 4 p.m. Adrian had shown up unannounced, spent 40 minutes in Vanessa's office, and left looking pleased with himself in a way that suggested he'd gotten something he wanted, or at least believed he had. Vanessa didn't come to the break room that night, or the next night. On the third night, Ethan found a note on his desk. Not a digital message, a physical note, handwritten on company stationery in handwriting so precise it looked like a font. I know what you're thinking. You're wrong. My office, 9 p.m. V. He went. She was behind her desk again, glasses on, but this time there were 2 cups of coffee already poured. She'd ordered from the cafe downstairs. The good stuff, not the break room machine that tasted like hot disappointment. Adrian Vale, he said, sitting down. Your ex. Is that what the 17th floor is calling him? That and some other things. He's not my ex. He's a mistake I made when I was 28 and lonely and convinced that someone who understood balance sheets could also understand me. He couldn't. He wanted the version of me that looked good at galas and didn't argue during board dinners. When he realized that version doesn't exist, he left. Daniel said you pushed him out. I did. After he started undermining my authority in meetings and telling investors I was too emotional to run the company. Emotional being his word for wouldn't do what he wanted. And now he's back. He's always back. He has a stake in one of our subsidiary holdings, and he uses it as a door pass. It's annoying but manageable. What did he want today? She hesitated. That was unusual. Vanessa Laurent didn't hesitate. He wants to come back to the company in a senior advisory role. He pitched it as a stability play for the investors. And what do you think? I think he wants to be close to me again, and he's using the company as an excuse, but his investor relationships are real, and the board is already whispering about our expansion timeline, and having Adrian on the advisory board would quiet some of that noise. So you're considering it. I'm considering what's best for the company. That's my job. Even if he's manipulating you? Her eyes went sharp, not angry, alert. Nobody manipulates me, Ethan. I see exactly what he's doing. I've always seen it. The difference between me and most people is that I can use someone's agenda without being controlled by it. He believed her. And the fact that he believed her, without reservation, without the protective doubt he usually wrapped around people's claims, told him something about how far he'd already fallen. 2 days later, Adrian found Ethan. He was in the lobby, heading back from a lunch run, when Adrian stepped out from behind a column like he'd been waiting there, which he probably had. You're Walker, right? The new designer? Ethan Walker, yeah. Adrian Vale. He extended his hand. His grip was firm and calculated. I've heard good things about your work. Vanessa doesn't usually notice people at your level, so you must be doing something right. The words were friendly. The tone was not. Can I buy you a coffee? Adrian said. There's something I think you should hear. They sat in a cafe 2 blocks from the building. Adrian ordered an espresso and leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything and couldn't imagine why anyone would start now. I'll be direct, Adrian said. I know about your late nights with Vanessa. Ethan's jaw tightened. We work late. A lot of people work late. Sure. But a lot of people don't get handwritten notes on their desks from the CEO. Adrian smiled at Ethan's reaction. Relax. I'm not going to HR. I'm telling you this as someone who's been where you are. I doubt that. I've been in love with Vanessa Laurent. I've sat in her office after hours and felt like the most important person in the world because she was giving me her full attention. I've told myself I was different from everyone else who tried and failed. And then I watched it come apart, piece by piece, because the world doesn't let a woman like that have a normal relationship. What's your point? Adrian set his coffee down and looked at Ethan the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. My point is that you're a 32-year-old single father making $67,000 a year. You have a daughter who depends on you. You have no safety net. And you're developing feelings for a woman who lives in a world where people are bought and sold like stocks. Do you understand what happens if this goes wrong? You don't know anything about what's happening. I know everything about what's happening because it happened to me. She pulls you in with honesty. She makes you feel seen. She shows you the person behind the CEO, and you think you're special because nobody else gets to see that. But eventually the board notices, the press notices, the world notices. And then it's not two people connecting anymore. It's a story. And in that story, you're either the gold digger or the charity case, and she's either the victim or the predator. There's no version where you're just two people who fell in love. Ethan sat very still. Adrian's words landed like punches. Not because they were cruel, but because some of them were true. He'd had the same thoughts. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, he'd run the same calculations and reached the same conclusions. But hearing them from Adrian, from this polished, predatory man who wore his bitterness like cologne, changed something. Because Adrian wasn't warning Ethan. Adrian was telling Ethan to leave, and the reason wasn't concern or generosity. It was ownership. Even after 2 years. Even after being pushed out. Adrian still believed Vanessa belonged to him, or to his world, or to someone who understood the rules of wealth and power, not to a tired designer from Cleveland with a broken car heater and a daughter who ate off-brand cheese crackers. I appreciate the advice, Ethan said, standing up, but I'll figure it out myself. Adrian's smile faded. For a second, something cold and genuine flickered behind his eyes. You'll regret that. Maybe, but it'll be my regret. He walked back to the building. The cold air hit his face and he welcomed it. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of staying composed in front of a man who just tried to gut him psychologically over an espresso. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of Ava's bed while she finished a chapter of her book. Something about a girl who could talk to animals, Ava's current obsession. And when she put it down and looked up at him, he saw Claire's eyes in her face and felt the full staggering weight of what he was risking. Dad? Yeah, Bug. You seem different lately. Different how? She thought about it. She had Claire's habit of actually considering a question before answering it, turning it over like one of her park rocks, examining every side. Less tired, she said. Not like you slept more. Like you have more room inside. He didn't know what to say to that. A 9-year-old had just described his emotional state with more accuracy than any adult in his life. Is it because of work? She asked. Partly. Is it because of a person? He looked at her. She looked back. No agenda, no judgment, just curiosity. And something else. Something that looked like hope, fragile and careful. The hope of a child who'd watched her father be empty for 3 years and was seeing signs of life, and didn't want to scare them away by wanting them too much. Yeah, he said quietly. I think it might be because of a person. She nodded, like this confirmed a theory she'd been developing. Then she pulled the covers up to her chin and said, Good. You should have a person. Mom would want you to have a person. He turned off her light and stood in the hallway for a long time, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, his daughter's words echoing in the dark apartment like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Mom would want you to have a person. He didn't sleep much that night either, but for different reasons than usual. Ava's words stayed with him for days. They lived in a place behind his ribs where grief usually sat, crowding it slightly, shifting the weight distribution of everything he carried. Mom would want you to have a person. He kept turning it over, examining it the way Ava examined her rocks, looking for cracks, testing its durability. And the thing was, she was right. Claire would have wanted that. Claire, who had made him promise on a Tuesday afternoon, Not her last day, but close to it, when the morphine was making her honest in ways that healthy people couldn't afford to be. That he wouldn't turn their daughter's childhood into a shrine. She needs a father who's alive, Claire had said, her voice thin as paper. Not one who's just still breathing. He'd nodded and held her hand and made the promise, and then spent 3 years breaking it. The executive retreat was announced on a Monday, 2 weeks after Adrian's coffee ambush. A company-wide email went out detailing a 4-day weekend at a luxury lakeside resort in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Senior leadership, department heads, and select team members. Daniel told Ethan he was on the list. Me? I've been here 4 months. Vanessa personally approved the attendee list. Your name was on it. Don't read into it. I'm not reading into anything. Good. Because I am, and I don't like what I'm reading. Daniel looked at him over the top of his monitor. He was a careful man, Daniel. Not cruel, not political, just aware. He'd been at Laurent Media for 9 years, and he'd survived by understanding the difference between what was his business and what wasn't, and by occasionally blurring that line when someone he cared about was walking toward a cliff. Ethan, I'm going to say something, and you're going to let me say it, and then we'll never discuss it again. Okay. Vanessa is the best CEO I've ever worked for. She's also the loneliest person I've ever met. Those two things are connected, and they are dangerous. She collects people who see her clearly, and she holds on to them too tight, and when the world notices, it punishes both parties. I watched it happen with Adrian. I don't want to watch it happen with you. Daniel, I said you'd let me say it. I'm done. Go back to work. Ethan went back to work. But Daniel's words joined Ava's in that space behind his ribs, and the weight shifted again, and he realized he was carrying an entire conversation in there now. Claire's promise, Ava's permission, Daniel's warning, Adrian's threat, Vanessa's vulnerability, all of it pressing against him from the inside, demanding a decision he wasn't ready to make. He called Marcus that night from the parking garage. The heater was still broken. His breath made clouds in the cold air. There's a retreat, he said. 4 days, upstate New York. Vanessa's going to be there. And I'm scared, Mark. I'm scared that if I spend 4 days in the same building with her, away from the office, away from the rules and the glass walls and the other people, I'm scared I'll say something I can't take back. You already said it in a text message 3 months ago. That was an accident. Was it? Because for a guy who claims he accidentally confessed his feelings, you've been spending a lot of time making sure those feelings have room to grow. Ethan closed his eyes. Marcus was smarter than people gave him credit for. He had a mechanic's brain. He could look at a system and see which parts were stressed and which ones were about to fail. And right now he was telling Ethan that the system was under pressure and the failure point was approaching whether Ethan wanted it to or not. What do I do? You go to the retreat. You do your job, and when the moment comes, and it will come, because you two are circling each other like planets and eventually gravity wins, you tell the truth, not the careful version, not the version that protects your career or your pride, the whole truth, and then you let her decide what to do with it. And if she decides wrong, then you survive it, like you've survived everything else. He arranged for Diane to stay with Ava for the long weekend. Ava took the news with her usual composure, which was both comforting and heartbreaking. A kid who'd gotten so used to her father leaving that she'd stopped making a fuss about it. Will you bring me something? She asked while he packed. Like what? A rock. If there's a lake, there'll be good rocks. I'll find you the best rock in New York. Not the best. The most interesting. Best is boring. Interesting has stories. He zipped his bag and hugged her and drove to the airport with her words rattling around in his head alongside everything else. Not the best. The most interesting. He wondered when his 9-year-old had become the wisest person he knew. The resort was the kind of place Ethan had only seen in magazines, a sprawling property on the shore of Seneca Lake, all stone and timber and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the boundary between inside and outside feel like a suggestion rather than a rule. The trees were bare. The lake was steel gray, and the sky had the heavy, low-hanging look of a region that had committed to winter and wasn't interested in apologies. He shared a cabin with Daniel and 2 other mid-level employees. The first day was structured, strategy sessions, breakout groups. a keynote from Vanessa that was sharp and forward-looking and received a standing ovation that she accepted with a nod and a single sentence. Standing ovations are for theaters. Sit down and let's get to work. Ethan watched her from the back of the room. She moved through the day with the same relentless precision she brought to the office, but there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when the mask slipped. During a break, he saw her alone on the covered patio, staring out at the lake, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression open and unguarded in a way it never was inside Laurent Media's glass walls. She looked tired. Not physically, something deeper. The tiredness of someone who'd been performing for so long that the performance had started to feel like the real thing, and the real thing had started to feel like a memory. Adrian was there too. Of course he was. He'd been appointed to the advisory board the previous week, Vanessa's concession to investor pressure. And he moved through the retreat like a host rather than a guest, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. He found Ethan on the second morning by the coffee station in the main lodge. "Beautiful place," Adrian said, stirring his cup slowly. Vanessa always did have taste. In properties, anyway. Her taste in people needs work. Ethan poured his coffee and didn't respond. "You know she picked this resort because her parents brought her here as a child. Before the accident, before the money, she used to swim in that lake." Adrian looked out the window. "She told me that once, late at night, after too much wine. The things she tells people late at night. Those are weapons, Walker. She just doesn't know she's loading the gun." "Are you going somewhere with this?" "I'm going everywhere with this. I'm telling you that the intimacy you think you have with her is a pattern. She gets close to someone, shows them the real Vanessa, and then the world tears it apart, and she retreats behind the armor again. I've seen it. I lived it. The difference between you and me is that I had the resources to survive the fallout. You don't. Maybe the difference between you and me is that I'm not trying to own her." Adrian's face changed. The smoothness cracked, just for a second, and underneath it, Ethan saw something that surprised him. Pain. Real pain. The kind that comes from losing something you thought was yours and realizing it never was. "You think I wanted to own her?" Adrian said, his voice lower now, the performance stripped away. "I loved her. In my way, with my limitations, I loved her. And it wasn't enough. Not because I wasn't good enough, because the world wouldn't let it be enough. Every dinner was photographed. Every argument was dissected by people who didn't know us. Every decision she made was filtered through the question of whether I was influencing her. And every decision I made was filtered through the question of whether she was controlling me. That's what you're walking into. And you're walking into it without money, without power, without anything to protect yourself when it all comes down." For the first time, Ethan didn't have a ready answer, because Adrian wasn't performing anymore. He was warning. And the warning came from a place of genuine experience, which made it impossible to dismiss entirely. "I hear you," Ethan said. "I do. But I'm not you." "No," Adrian agreed. "You're not. You're worse off, because you actually care about her, and caring is the thing that makes you most vulnerable." He walked away. Ethan stood by the coffee station, holding a cup that had gone cold, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The second day bled into the third. Strategy sessions gave way to informal dinners, and the hierarchy of the company softened around the edges the way it does when people are away from the office, and slightly loosened by good wine and the particular intimacy of a shared location. Ethan found himself in conversations with executives he'd never spoken to, people who treated him with casual friendliness once they learned he was the designer behind the Meridian rebrand that Vanessa had approved without notes. He saw Vanessa in groups, at meals, during sessions. They exchanged a few words here and there, professional, appropriate, unremarkable. But twice, he caught her looking at him across the room with an expression that wasn't professional, or appropriate, or unremarkable at all. It was searching. Hungry, almost. Like she was trying to figure out whether the version of him she saw in break rooms at midnight existed in daylight too. On the third evening, after dinner, the group fractured into smaller clusters. Some people went to the bar, others retreated to cabins. Ethan pulled on a coat and walked down to the lake because the noise was getting to him. Not the volume, but the performance of it, the way corporate people talked louder and laughed harder when they were trying to prove they could relax. The dock was wooden, old and solid. It jutted out about 40 feet over the water, and at the end of it there was a bench that someone had bolted to the planks years ago. The wood was weathered, almost white. The lake was black under a winter sky full of stars that Cleveland's light pollution had been hiding from him for years. He sat on the bench and breathed. The air was so cold it felt like drinking water, sharp and clean and real. He could see the resort behind him, warm and glowing, and the mountains beyond the lake, dark and enormous and indifferent to everything happening on their shore. He heard the wheels before he saw her. The dock planks had enough space between them that a wheelchair shouldn't have been able to navigate them easily, but Vanessa came down the slope on a paved path that connected to the dock's entry point. A ramp, he realized, that the resort had built. Or that she'd had built. He didn't ask. She stopped beside the bench. The starlight caught the thin gold chain at her throat. "Room for one more?" she said. "Always." She positioned her chair at the end of the dock, next to the bench, so they were side by side, both facing the water. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have said so many careful things that the absence of words feels more honest than any sentence could. "Adrian talked to you again," she said. Not a question. "This morning, by the coffee." "What did he say?" "That caring about you makes me vulnerable. That the world won't let us be normal. That I'll get destroyed." "And what did you think?" "I think he's not entirely wrong." She turned her head to look at him. In the dark, her face was mostly shadow, but her eyes caught the light from the resort windows behind them, and they were steady and serious and afraid. "He's not entirely wrong," she agreed. "He's just wrong about the conclusion. He thinks the risk means you should walk away. I think the risk means the opposite." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything worth having in my life has come with a cost. This company cost me my 20s. The accident cost me my legs. Building something real in a world that wants to reduce you to a headline, that costs something too, but I've never once regretted paying. I've only regretted the things I was too afraid to buy." Ethan felt his heart hammering, not from nerves, from the weight of what was happening. They were at the edge of something. The conversation had carried them here over weeks and months of careful circling, and now the circling was done and they were standing at the line, and the only question left was whether they would cross it. "Vanessa." "Yes." "I need to tell you something, and I need to get it right." "Then take your time." He looked out at the lake. The water was so still it looked solid, like you could walk across it if you were brave enough or foolish enough to try. "I fell in love with you," he said. "Not because of the money or the company or the power. I fell in love with you because when you look at someone, really look at them, you see everything they are, and you don't flinch. You see the broken parts and the messy parts and the parts they're ashamed of, and you take it all in and you stay. You don't soften it, you don't fix it, you just see it. And for someone who's spent 3 years feeling invisible, just a tired guy getting through the day, being seen like that is the most terrifying, most important thing that's ever happened to me." He paused. The cold air burned in his lungs. "I'm not rich. I can't protect you from headlines. I don't understand half of what happens in your boardroom. But I know what it's like to carry something heavy alone. And I know what it's like to meet someone who makes the weight shift. And I know that I am standing on this dock telling you the truth because you told me once that you stopped pretending, and I figured it was time I did too." The silence after he finished was enormous. It filled the space between them and the lake and the sky and the mountains, and for 5 terrible seconds he thought he'd miscalculated, that he'd broken something irreparable with his honesty, that she was going to say something kind and professional and devastating. Then Vanessa reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. His were colder. The contact was imperfect, slightly off-center, her thumb landing on his knuckle instead of the back of his hand, and that imperfection made it real. "I've been terrified of this," she said, and her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it, stripped of every layer of authority and control and public armor until there was nothing left but the woman underneath. "I've been terrified because I know what happens next. The board finds out. The press finds out. They'll say you're chasing money. They'll say I'm using power. They'll reduce this to a transaction because that's what people do when they can't understand something honest." "I know." And I've been terrified because the last time I let someone in, he spent a year telling me I was too much, and then walked out, and I spent 6 months convincing myself he was right. He wasn't right. I know that now. But knowing something and believing it are different, and I'm still working on the believing part. Her hand tightened around his. Not desperate, deliberate, a choice. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know how to be a CEO and a partner and a public figure and a real person all at the same time. I've been juggling 3 of those my entire career, and the 4th one, the real person part, keeps getting dropped. Then we figure it out, together, badly, probably, with mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing in front of the wrong people, and you're going to make a decision that hurts my feelings because the company needed it. And we're going to fight about things that don't matter because we're scared about things that do. But we figure it out. She was quiet for a long time. The lake lapped gently against the dock pilings. Somewhere behind them, the muffled sound of laughter drifted from the resort bar. My legs don't work, she said. And the way she said it, flat, factual, almost clinical, told him that this was something she'd said to every person who'd ever gotten close, a landmine she planted early so she could see who flinched. I know, he said. My wife died. My car heater's broken. My daughter eats off-brand crackers. We all have things. The laugh that came out of her was sudden and raw and real. Not the controlled half-smile she gave at company events, but an actual laugh, messy and surprised and slightly too loud for a winter dock at 11 p.m. She covered her mouth with her free hand, and when she dropped it, she was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Unguarded, open. Not the careful vulnerability of their midnight conversations, but something wilder and more reckless. The look of someone who just decided to stop calculating the odds and jump. Okay, she said. Okay, we figure it out. He squeezed her hand, she squeezed back, and they sat there on that dock in the freezing cold, 2 people who had no business being together by any rational measure, the billionaire CEO and the widowed designer, the woman in the wheelchair and the man with the empty bank account, 2 broken people who'd spent years building walls and had somehow found a crack in each other's, and the lake was black and the stars were bright, and neither of them let go. When they finally went inside separately, 15 minutes apart so nobody would notice, Ethan found a smooth gray stone on the edge of the dock ramp. He picked it up and put it in his pocket. It wasn't the best rock, it wasn't even particularly pretty, but it was cold and solid and real, and when he held it in his fist, he could feel the weight of it, and that weight felt like the beginning of something that was going to change everything. Ava was going to love it. They came back from the retreat on a Sunday, and by Tuesday the rumors had already started. Ethan didn't know who saw them on the dock. Maybe nobody did. Maybe it was the way they looked at each other during the final morning session, or the way Vanessa had paused at his table during the closing breakfast and said something that made him laugh. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and catches people's attention because it sounds different from the polite corporate variety. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe people just sensed it, the way animals sense a change in weather, something in the air pressure between 2 people that shifts when they stop pretending they're nothing to each other. By Wednesday, Daniel pulled Ethan into a conference room and closed the door. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask it once. And whatever you tell me, I'll take at face value because I trust you. Okay. Is something happening between you and Vanessa? Ethan considered lying. The lie was right there, sitting on his tongue, easy and protective and practical. Nothing's happening. We're colleagues. She mentors me. Any of those sentences would have ended this conversation and bought him more time, but Vanessa had told him she stopped pretending, and on that dock, he'd decided to do the same. Yes, he said. Something is happening. Daniel sat down heavily. He rubbed his face with both hands, the way people do when they're processing something they expected but hoped wouldn't be true. How far? We've talked. We've been honest with each other. Nothing physical beyond holding hands. Holding hands. Daniel repeated it like he was testing the weight of it. You held hands with the CEO. On a dock. In the dark. It was 10 degrees outside and we were both freezing, and I don't think either of us planned it. Ethan, nobody plans anything. That's not the point. The point is that you work for her. Directly, technically, I'm your supervisor, but she approved your hire, she reviews your work, she controls your career trajectory. In any HR framework on the planet, this is a problem. I know. Do you? Because knowing and acting like you know are different things, and right now you're acting like a guy who found something wonderful and hasn't thought about the paperwork. It was a fair hit. Ethan took it. What do you want me to do? He asked. I want you to be careful. I want you to think about what happens when this stops being a secret, because it will stop being a secret. In this building, everything does. Daniel was right. By the following week, the whispers had migrated from vague speculation to specific accusation. Ethan heard his name in hallways, saw conversations die when he approached the break room, noticed people glancing at him during meetings with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. Nobody said anything to his face. That wasn't how corporate ecosystems worked. They said it to each other, and each other said it to someone else, and the story grew like mold in the walls, invisible until it wasn't. The first person to say it directly was a senior account executive named Rachel Dunn during a creative review meeting. Ethan was presenting revised assets for a client campaign. The work was strong, he knew it. Daniel knew it, the numbers supported it. Rachel sat through the presentation with her arms crossed, and when he finished, she said, "Is this the creative direction you discussed with Vanessa over the weekend? Or did that conversation happen on company time?" The room went silent. The kind of silent where you can hear the HVAC system and everyone's careful breathing. The creative direction was developed with Daniel's input and approved through normal channels, Ethan said. His voice was steady. His hands, under the table, were not. Normal channels. Rachel smiled. It was not a kind smile. Of course. Daniel ended the meeting early. In the hallway afterward, he looked at Ethan with something between sympathy and frustration. "That's going to get worse," Daniel said. "You understand that, right?" It got worse. Over the next 2 weeks, the story crystallized from rumor into narrative. Ethan Walker, the underpaid single father from nowhere, was sleeping with the CEO. That was the version most people told because it was the simplest and the most satisfying. It had a villain, a victim, and a moral. And it required zero nuance. Some people cast Ethan as the villain, the opportunist who'd targeted a vulnerable, disabled woman for her money. Others cast Vanessa as the villain, the powerful CEO who'd exploited a subordinate who couldn't afford to say no. Both versions were wrong. Neither version mattered because the truth had stopped being relevant the moment the story became more interesting without it. Vanessa called him to her office on a Friday evening. She looked tired in a way he hadn't seen before. Not the productive late-night tiredness of a woman who chose to work until midnight, but the ground-down exhaustion of someone fighting on too many fronts. 3 board members called me this week, she said. Separately, scripted, the same talking points, which means someone coordinated it. Adrian? Probably. But it doesn't matter who. What matters is the message. They want me to address the situation. Those were the words. Address the situation. And what does that mean? It means they want me to either publicly deny the relationship or distance myself from you professionally, transfer you to another department, reduce your visibility, make the story go away. And if you don't, then they'll raise it at the next board meeting, formally. They'll frame it as a governance concern, CEO judgment, workplace ethics, fiduciary duty to shareholders. And once it's in the minutes, it becomes a legal matter. Ethan felt the floor tilt. Not dramatically, just enough to remind him that the ground he was standing on had never been solid to begin with. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to tell them to go to hell, but I run a company, and running a company means I don't always get to do what I want. I have 12,000 employees whose livelihoods depend on this organization being stable. I can't light that on fire because I fell for a designer who writes love letters to his brother by accident." Despite everything, he almost smiled. Almost. "So what are the options?" he said. Option 1, I transfer you. Different department, different floor, no direct reporting line. It satisfies the board, it reduces the optics, and it gives us room to continue this without the power dynamic argument. And option 2? Option 2, I don't transfer you. I tell the board that my personal life is not their jurisdiction. I take the hit, weather the storm, and dare them to make a legal case out of a woman choosing to date someone. There's a third option you're not saying. She looked at him, steady, unblinking. The third option is that we end this. Before it costs you your career and me my credibility. We go back to being CEO and designer, and we tell ourselves it was the responsible decision, and we spend the rest of our professional relationship pretending we don't feel like something got amputated. The word hit him. Amputated. From a woman who'd lost the use of her legs. She'd chosen it deliberately, he realized. Not for shock, but for precision. She knew what it meant to lose a part of yourself that you'd never get back. She was telling him this would feel exactly like that. I don't want option 3, he said. Neither do I. But I needed to say it out loud so we both know what we're choosing against. Option 1 then, the transfer. You'd be willing to do that? Vanessa, I'd work in the mailroom if it meant I could still take you to dinner without 3 lawyers reviewing the ethics implications. She stared at him for a beat. Then something happened that he'd only seen once before. On the dock, in the dark, when he told her about his broken car heater. She laughed. Not the controlled half smile. The real thing. Messy, surprised, cracking through the exhaustion on her face like sunlight through a storm. The mailroom, she repeated. You'd actually do it. I've done worse for less. I know you have. That's why I... She stopped. Regrouped. The laughter faded, replaced by something quieter and more serious. That's why I'm not willing to lose this. I'll make the call on Monday. HR will process the transfer by end of week. You'll move to the brand strategy team on 15. It's lateral. Same pay, same title, just a different reporting structure. And Adrian? Adrian is a problem I'll handle. He's been feeding the board concern because he thinks if he can't have me, he can at least control the narrative around me. He's wrong. He's been wrong about me since the day we met. The difference is that now I have something worth protecting, and that makes me more dangerous than he's ever seen. She said it without bravado, just fact. And Ethan believed her because he'd watched her dismantle a senior executive's proposal in 6 words and redirect a billion-dollar company's strategy in an afternoon. And if Vanessa Laurent decided Adrian Vale was a problem, then Adrian Vale was a problem with an expiration date. The transfer went through the following week. Ethan moved his things to the 15th floor, the photo of Ava, the succulent, the mechanical pencils, and set up at a new desk near a window that faced east instead of south. His new supervisor was a woman named Grace Chen, mid-40s, direct and efficient, who shook his hand and said, I don't care about gossip. I care about deadlines. We'll get along fine. They did. The work was different, more strategic, less hands-on. But Ethan adapted quickly, and the distance from Vanessa's direct purview took some of the pressure off. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they lost their urgency once the formal reporting relationship was severed. HR had a paper trail. The board had their governance concession. The machine was satisfied, at least temporarily. But satisfaction and acceptance are different things, and inside the building, Ethan could still feel the weight of judgment. People who'd been friendly before the rumors now greeted him with the polite distance of acquaintances who'd decided he wasn't worth the social risk. Invitations to after-work drinks dried up. He ate lunch alone more often than not. He didn't tell Vanessa about the isolation because she had enough to carry, and because he understood, with the uncomfortable clarity of a man who'd spent 3 years being alone, that loneliness was something he knew how to survive. It wasn't fatal. It was just cold. What he didn't expect was Ava. Vanessa had suggested dinner at Ethan's apartment, a quiet Saturday evening, nothing formal. I want to meet her, she'd said, and the simplicity of the request, no fanfare, no agenda, no performance, was what convinced Ethan to say yes. He spent the entire day cleaning. He scrubbed the kitchen, organized Ava's toys, bought groceries for a meal he only half knew how to cook, and changed the sheets on every bed in the apartment for reasons he couldn't explain even to himself. Marcus called at 4 to check in. How's the panic level? On a scale of 1 to 10, 47. She's meeting your kid, not inspecting your apartment. She's a billionaire, Mark. She's going to sit on my second-hand couch and eat chicken. I'm going to overcook, and my bathroom faucet drips, and there's a water stain on the bedroom ceiling that looks like Florida. Does she know about the water stain? She knows I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland with a broken car heater. I think she can handle a water stain. Then stop cleaning and start cooking. Vanessa arrived at 6. She'd driven herself not the corporate car, not the driver, just her own adapted vehicle, a dark SUV with hand controls that she parked on the street like anyone else. She came up the elevator in her wheelchair, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the corporate armor Ethan was used to. And when he opened the door, she looked at the apartment and then looked at him and said, "It smells like you burned something." "The garlic bread. I can save it." "Don't lie to me, Ethan. Is the garlic bread dead?" "The garlic bread is deceased." "Then we'll survive without it." "Where's your daughter?" Ava was standing in the doorway to her bedroom, half hidden behind the frame, watching. She'd been nervous all day. Not the anxious kind of nervous, but the quiet, observational kind that Ethan recognized as Claire's influence. She was studying the situation before entering it, gathering data, deciding. "Hi," Ava said. "Hi," Vanessa said. "I'm Vanessa. Your dad talks about you constantly, like a genuinely annoying amount." Ava looked at Ethan. He shrugged. She looked back at Vanessa. "He talks about you too," Ava said. "He tries not to, but he's bad at it." Vanessa glanced at Ethan. He felt his face get hot. "Good," Vanessa said to Ava. "Bad at hiding things is my favorite kind of person." Dinner was imperfect. The chicken was slightly dry. The salad was overdressed. The garlic bread was, as established, deceased. But Ava sat at the table, the folding table pushed against the kitchen counter, and ate everything on her plate and talked more than Ethan had heard her talk in months. She told Vanessa about the rocks, about the book with the girl who talked to animals, about her teacher who said she was exceptionally creative, a phrase Ava repeated with the careful pride of someone who'd memorized a compliment and kept it in her pocket like a talisman. Vanessa listened the way she listened in boardrooms, completely, without interruption, with her full attention, except that in the boardroom the attention had an edge to it, and here it was warm. She asked Ava questions. Real questions, not the patronizing kind adults ask children to fill silence, but the kind that made Ava think and consider and sometimes pause with her fork halfway to her mouth while she worked out an answer. "If you could talk to one animal, which one would you pick?" Vanessa asked. "Octopus?" Ava said without hesitation. "They have 3 hearts and blue blood, and they can change color. They probably know things we don't." That's the best answer I've ever heard to that question. "What would you pick?" "A crow. They hold grudges and they never forget a face. I respect that." Ava laughed. A real full-body 9-year-old laugh that filled the small apartment the way sunlight fills a room. Not gradually, but all at once, in every corner, impossible to ignore. Ethan stood at the sink washing dishes and listened to it and felt something unlock in his chest that had been sealed for 3 years. After dinner, Ava showed Vanessa her rock collection. They sat side by side, Ava cross-legged on the floor, Vanessa in her chair, and Ava explained each specimen with the seriousness of a museum curator. The gray one from the park, the striped one from Lake Erie, the white one that sparkled if you held it at the right angle. "This one's new," Ava said, picking up the stone from the dock. "Dad brought it from his work trip." "Is it the best one?" "No, it's the most interesting one. Best is boring." Vanessa looked at Ethan across the room. He looked back. And something passed between them that wasn't about romance or attraction or the complicated machinery of 2 adults trying to build something in the wreckage of their separate pasts. It was simpler than that. It was the recognition that this small apartment with the overcrowded rock collection and the dripping faucet and the child on the floor who said things wiser than she knew, this was what mattered, not the board, not the rumors, not Adrian Vale and his expensive espresso and his calculated warnings. This. Vanessa left at 9, after Ava had gone to bed. Ethan walked her to her car. The street was quiet, the Cleveland night air biting and sharp. "She's remarkable," Vanessa said. "You should know that. She's not just smart. She pays attention to things. She watches the world like she's collecting evidence. She gets that from her mother. She gets some of it from you." He opened the car door for her and watched her transfer into the driver's seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and refused to let it be a production. She settled, adjusted the hand controls, and looked up at him through the open door. "Ethan." "Yeah." "I sat on your second-hand couch and ate your overcooked chicken and your bathroom faucet drips, and there is definitely a stain on your ceiling." "I told you. And it was the best night I've had in years." She closed the door. He stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights disappear around the corner, and the cold didn't bother him, and the dripping faucet didn't bother him, and the water stain on the ceiling could grow into the shape of the entire eastern seaboard for all he cared. He went inside. He checked on Ava. She was asleep, the book about animals open on her chest, the dock rock on her nightstand. He removed the book, pulled the covers up, and turned off the light. In the doorway, he paused. "She likes you, Bug," he whispered. "And you were perfect tonight." From the bed, so quiet he almost missed it, Ava murmured, "Dad, you smile the same way you used to, before everything." He stood in the hallway with his hand on the doorframe, and his daughter's words hit him with the force of something he'd been running from for 3 years. Before everything. Before the diagnosis, before the hospital, before the apartment, and the broken heater, and the empty side of the bed. Before grief became the organizing principle of his entire existence. He smiled the same way. She'd noticed. Of course she'd noticed. She noticed everything. This kid, this extraordinary, rock-collecting, animal-talking, cereal-pouring kid who'd been watching her father come back to life and waiting quietly for him to realize it himself. He walked to the kitchen and sat at the folding table in the dark. The apartment was quiet. The faucet dripped. The ceiling stain loomed. And Ethan Walker cried. Not the controlled, silent tears he'd trained himself to produce when the grief surfaced at inconvenient moments. Real crying, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from the basement of yourself and doesn't care about composure or timing or whether the walls are thin enough for a sleeping child to hear. He cried because Ava was right. He was smiling again. And that meant Claire's absence wasn't the only real thing in his life anymore. And that meant he was moving forward. And moving forward meant admitting that the years of standing still, the years of quiet survival, of getting through, of keeping his head down and his heart locked, those years were over. Not wasted, not meaningless, just finished. He wiped his face with a dish towel. He blew his nose. He drank a glass of water standing at the sink, staring out the window at the street light that flickered every 30 seconds and had been flickering since they moved in. Then he picked up his phone and texted Vanessa. "Ava wants to know if you'll come back next Saturday. She has more rocks to show you." The response came in under a minute. "Tell her I'll bring my own." Vanessa came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that, until the visits stopped feeling like events and started feeling like routine, which was, Ethan realized, the entire point. Because routine meant safety. Routine meant Ava could stop holding her breath every time the doorbell rang, wondering if this person was temporary too. Routine meant Ethan could stop treating happiness like a guest that might leave and start treating it like someone who was unpacking. The Saturdays had a rhythm. Vanessa would arrive around noon, usually with something, a book for Ava, a bag of groceries because she'd noticed Ethan's refrigerator was perpetually understocked, once a set of geology tools she'd ordered online after Ava mentioned wanting to crack open a geode. They'd cook together, or attempt to, because Vanessa's culinary skills were roughly on par with Ethan's, which meant a lot of burned garlic bread and oversalted pasta, and one memorable incident involving a smoke detector and a pan of blackened salmon that Ava filmed on Ethan's phone and threatened to post online. "You post that and I'll fire your father," Vanessa said. "You can't fire him. He doesn't work for you anymore." "I'll rehire him and then fire him." "That seems like a lot of effort for a salmon video." "You underestimate my commitment to reputation management." Ava grinned. It was the grin of a child who'd found someone who matched her energy. Not the careful, modulated energy of adults who talk down to kids, but the real thing, sharp and playful, and willing to lose an argument for the sake of a good joke. Vanessa treated Ava the way she treated everyone, with directness, honesty, and the assumption that the person across from her was smart enough to handle both. Ethan watched them and felt the tectonic plates of his life shifting beneath him. Not dramatically. No earthquakes, no sudden ruptures. Just the slow, grinding adjustment of a landscape rearranging itself into something new. 3 years ago, this apartment had been a bunker, a place to survive. Now it was filling up with noise and laughter and arguments about whether octopuses were smarter than crows, and the smell of food that was slightly wrong but made with effort, and that was better than anything he'd had in a long time. The world outside the apartment, however, was less accommodating. The board meeting happened in mid-February, 6 weeks after the retreat. Vanessa had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, strategically, with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that the difference between winning and losing often came down to who did their homework. She'd restructured Ethan's reporting line. She'd documented the timeline. She'd consulted with legal. She'd done everything right. It wasn't enough. 3 board members, encouraged, Vanessa suspected, by Adrian's quiet campaigning, raised a formal concern about executive conduct and its potential impact on organizational credibility. The language was sanitized, corporate, stripped of any direct accusation, because that was how power operated at this level. You didn't attack, you implied, and the implication was often more damaging than the accusation would have been. Vanessa told Ethan about it that night, on the phone, her voice flat and controlled in the way it got when she was furious and choosing not to show it. "They're not going to push it to a vote," she said. "They don't have the numbers, but they put it on the record, which means it exists now. Officially. The CEO's relationship is a documented governance concern. What does that mean practically? Practically, it means every decision I make for the next 6 months will be scrutinized through the lens of whether my personal life is affecting my judgment. If the stock dips, it's because I'm distracted. If a deal falls through, it's because I'm compromised. They've planted a seed, and now they just have to water it." Vanessa, I'm not asking for comfort. I'm telling you the reality, so we're both looking at the same map. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you okay?" The question hung there. He heard her breathe. "No," she said. "I'm angry. I'm angry because I've run this company flawlessly for 6 years. I have tripled revenue. I have expanded into 4 new markets. I have navigated a recession and a pandemic and a hostile takeover attempt, and I did all of it from a wheelchair. And not once did anyone question my judgment. But I fall in love with a man who isn't wealthy or connected or on the approved list, and suddenly my competence is in question. That's not about competence. That's about control. I know what it's about. It's about a group of men who've spent their careers deciding what women like me are allowed to have. A career, yes. Money, fine. But a personal life that doesn't fit their narrative? That's where they draw the line." Her voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough for Ethan to hear the person underneath the CEO, the woman who'd spent her entire adult life being strong enough to not need anyone, and was now discovering that needing someone made you a target in ways that strength never did. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You know that." "I know. That's the part that scares them." The weeks that followed were hard. Not hard the way grief had been hard, cette femme. Not the slow, crushing weight of absence, but hard the way a siege is hard. Constant pressure from all sides. The feeling of being surrounded by forces that couldn't be fought directly because they operated through implication and innuendo, rather than open confrontation. At the office, Ethan kept his head down. He did his work. He met his deadlines. He was polite and professional and gave no one any ammunition. Grace Chen, his new supervisor, treated him with matter-of-fact decency and never once mentioned the rumors, which Ethan suspected was her way of making a statement without making a statement. Outside the office, the story leaked. Someone, Adrian, Ethan assumed, though he couldn't prove it, tipped a business journalist, and a short piece appeared in an industry publication with the headline, "Laurent Media CEO's Relationship with Employee Raises Governance Questions." The article was careful, factually accurate, and devastating in its neutrality. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It just laid out the facts and let readers draw their own conclusions, which they did, loudly, in the comment section. Gold digger, power trip. Desperate widow targets disabled billionaire. Rich woman buys herself a boyfriend. The comments were a gallery of assumptions, each one a tiny portrait of what people believed about money and love and power and disability when they had permission to say what they really thought. Ethan read them once, in the parking garage, sitting in his car with the broken heater while his breath made clouds in the cold air. Then he put the phone in the glove compartment and drove home and helped Ava with her math homework and didn't mention it to anyone. Vanessa read them too. He knew because she called him at midnight that night and said, without preamble, "Someone in the comments called you a predator and me a victim," in the same sentence, as if those are the only roles available. Don't read the comments. I'm the CEO of a media company. Reading comments is literally my job. It's not your job to absorb other people's ignorance at midnight. She was quiet. Then, how do you do it? How do you not care what they say? I care. I just care about you and Ava more. The math is simple. The execution is hard. The execution was hard. There were mornings Ethan woke up and felt the weight of public judgment pressing on his chest before he even opened his eyes, a physical heaviness that made getting out of bed feel like swimming through sand. He thought about Ava reading those comments someday. He thought about her classmates' parents seeing the article. He thought about parent-teacher conferences and school plays and all the small, ordinary moments of a child's life that could be contaminated by a story that had nothing to do with her. Marcus talked him through the worst nights. "You're not a headline," Marcus said, again and again, with the patience of a man who understood that his brother needed to hear the same truth repeated because trauma had a way of making you forget things you already knew. You're a father and a good person and you love someone. That's the story. Everything else is noise. Noise with a comment section. Noise with a comment section. But since when does noise get to decide your life? The turning point came in late March, 2 months after the board meeting, and it didn't come from the boardroom or the press or any of the arenas where Ethan expected the battle to be fought. It came from Vanessa. She called a special session with the full board of directors. Ethan didn't know about it until afterward. She'd kept it from him deliberately, she later explained, because she didn't want him to talk her out of it. Or, worse, to feel responsible for what she was about to do. The session lasted 3 hours. Vanessa spoke for 40 minutes of it. She didn't defend the relationship. She didn't apologize. She didn't frame it as a personal matter that was separate from her professional role. She did the opposite. "I run this company with every part of who I am," she told them, according to the account she gave Ethan later, sitting in his apartment, her voice hoarse from the effort of having been more honest in a boardroom than anyone had ever been. "My intelligence, my instincts, my experience, my disability, my loneliness, my capacity for love. All of it. You don't get to select which parts of me are acceptable and which parts threaten your comfort. I am not a partial person. I have never been a partial person, and the suggestion that my personal life diminishes my professional judgment is an insult to every decision I've made in 6 years of leading this organization." She'd presented the numbers. Revenue up 18% year over year, market share expanding, client retention at an all-time high. Stock price stable and climbing. Every metric the board cared about was trending in the right direction, and not a single one of them had wavered since her relationship with Ethan became public. "If you want to challenge my leadership," she'd said, "do it on the merits. Bring me a quarter where I failed. Bring me a deal I botched. Bring me a single strategic error that can be attributed to my personal life. And if you can't, and you can't because they don't exist, then I suggest you redirect your energy towards something productive, because I have a company to run and I'm done having this conversation." The boardroom had been silent. Not the respectful silence of agreement, but the stunned silence of people who'd been outmaneuvered so completely they didn't know where to put their hands. Adrian had been in the room. Vanessa told Ethan that he'd sat through her entire speech without speaking, his face unreadable, his hands folded in front of him. When it was over, he'd stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without a word. He resigned from the advisory board by email that evening. No explanation, no parting shot. Just a single paragraph of corporate language that said nothing and meant everything. "He's done," Vanessa said, sitting on Ethan's second-hand couch, her shoes off, her feet tucked under a blanket Ava had draped over her without being asked. "He'll surface again somewhere. Men like Adrian always do. But he's done here. With this company. With me. How do you feel?" She thought about it, really thought about it, the way she thought about everything. Not performing reflection, but actually sitting with the question and turning it over. Lighter, she said, like I've been carrying a suitcase for 6 years, and I just realized I could put it down. That's a lot of suitcase. You have no idea. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, not gracefully, not the way it happens in films where two bodies fit together with cinematic precision. Awkwardly. His elbow bumped the arm of her wheelchair. She had to shift twice to find a comfortable angle. His shoulder was too high and hers was at the wrong position, and for a few seconds they were just two people trying to figure out the geometry of closeness in a space that wasn't designed for it. Then she settled, her head against his chest, her hand on his knee, and it was imperfect and uncomfortable, and neither of them moved for a very long time. Spring arrived in Cleveland the way it always did, grudgingly, with false starts and cold snaps, and one last snowfall in April that everyone pretended to be outraged about, even though it happened every year. The water stain on Ethan's ceiling stopped growing, not because he'd called the landlord, but because the season changed and the leak dried up, which wasn't a solution but was close enough to feel like one. The months that followed the board confrontation were quieter. Not silent. The whispers at work continued, diluted now but still present, like background radiation from an explosion that had already happened. But the formal pressure evaporated. The board had been neutralized. The article faded from the news cycle. Adrian disappeared into whatever world ex-CFOs and ex-lovers inhabited when they ran out of leverage. Ethan and Vanessa settled into something that resembled a real relationship, with all the mess and mundanity that entailed. They argued about real things, his tendency to defer to her authority when they disagreed, her tendency to make unilateral decisions and inform him afterward, the power imbalance that lived in the architecture of their lives, no matter how carefully they tried to design around it. He made $67,000 a year, and she was worth $3 billion, and no amount of love or goodwill could make that gap invisible. It was always there, in the background, like the hum of a machine they'd both agreed to live with. "You paid for the groceries again," he said one evening, more sharply than he intended. "Because I was at the store and I had my card. You always have your card. And the groceries always cost 3 times what I'd spend because you buy the organic everything and the artisan bread that costs $9 a loaf. It's good bread. It's $9 bread, Vanessa. My bread costs $2.50 and it comes in a bag with a twist tie." Are we actually fighting about bread? We're fighting about the fact that you have more money than some countries and I clip coupons. And sometimes that makes me feel like I'm not pulling my weight. And I know that's my problem and not yours, but I need you to hear it instead of solving it by buying more expensive groceries. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put down the $9 bread and said, "You're right. I hear you, and I'm sorry. I do that. I use money to fix things because money is the tool I'm most comfortable with. But you're not a problem I need to fix. You're a person I need to listen to, and I'm still learning the difference." It wasn't a clean resolution. He still felt the gap. She still bought the expensive bread sometimes. But they talked about it, and the talking was the thing that mattered. Not because it solved the problem, but because it proved that the problem wasn't bigger than their willingness to face it. Ava, meanwhile, became the part of the equation that nobody had predicted and everyone needed. She moved between Ethan and Vanessa with the fluid ease of a child who'd decided that love was not a finite resource and therefore didn't require rationing. She asked Vanessa questions that no adult would dare to ask. About the wheelchair, about the accident, about whether her legs hurt, about what it felt like to not be able to walk. And Vanessa answered every one of them with the same unflinching honesty she brought to boardrooms, except softer. "Does it make you sad?" Ava asked one afternoon, sitting on the floor of Ethan's apartment, sorting rocks by color while Vanessa reviewed quarterly reports on her tablet. "Sometimes," Vanessa said. "Not all the time. Mostly it makes me frustrated when buildings don't have ramps or when people talk to the person pushing my chair instead of talking to me. But sad? Less than you'd think." Because you got used to it?" "Because I decided that being sad about something I can't change was a waste of the time I have. And I have a lot of things I want to do with my time." "Like what?" "Like watching you sort rocks and pretending I understand why the gray ones and the silver ones are in different piles." "Gray is matte. Silver has mica. They're completely different." I stand corrected. "You're sitting." Vanessa looked at her. Ava looked back, the faintest hint of mischief in her expression. And then Vanessa laughed. The real laugh, the messy one. The one Ethan had only started hearing since the dock. And Ava laughed too, and Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them and thought, this is what healing looks like. Not a finish line, not a moment where everything clicks into place and the music swells and the credits roll. Just two people laughing on a floor covered in rocks, while a man with a dish towel over his shoulder stands 10 feet away and feels, for the first time in 3 years, that the future is something he wants to walk toward, instead of something he's just enduring. The idea for the dinner came to him in June, almost a year to the day since the accidental text message. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, not the water stain, which had faded to a ghost of itself, but the ceiling beyond it, the blank space where possibilities lived. And the idea arrived whole and complete, the way the best ideas do, not built but discovered, like something that had been waiting for him to be ready to find it. He called Marcus first. I need your help with something. Name it. I want to do a dinner. Small, family, close friends. Vanessa, Ava, you, Mom, Diane. He paused. I'm going to ask her something. Marcus was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was a long time for a man who usually talked like he was being charged by the word. Are you sure? Marcus asked. Not challenging, checking. I've never been more sure of anything, not since Claire. Then tell me what you need. He planned it for 2 weeks. Not the kind of planning that involved event coordinators and venue rentals and the apparatus of wealth. Vanessa could have that any day of the week, and that wasn't what this was about. He planned it the way he'd planned things with Claire, by hand, with attention, with the understanding that meaning lived in the details that nobody else would notice. He reserved the back room of a small Italian restaurant on the west side, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and an owner named Sal, who'd been making the same marinara recipe for 40 years and would fight anyone who suggested he change it. He invited 8 people, Marcus and his wife, Ethan's mother Diane, Daniel and his wife Priya from HR, who'd been kind to Ethan on his first day and had never stopped, and Grace Chen, who'd been decent to him when decency was scarce. Ava was the only one who knew what was happening. He told her 2 days before the dinner, sitting on the edge of her bed during the quiet minutes before sleep. I'm going to ask Vanessa something important on Saturday night, he said, and I wanted to tell you first because it affects you too, and your opinion matters more than anyone else's. You're going to ask her to marry you. He blinked. How did you... Dad, I'm 9, not stupid. Okay, yes. I'm going to ask her to marry you. Me. Us. To marry us. She'll say yes. You don't know that. Yes, I do. She looks at you the same way Mom used to look at you when you were drawing and didn't know she was watching, like you're the most interesting thing in the room. He didn't have a response to that. His daughter had just described something he hadn't noticed, with the precision of someone who'd been paying attention long before the adults realized she was in the room. Are you okay with it? He asked. With all of this? With Vanessa being part of our family? Ava was quiet for a moment. She pulled the covers up to her chin and looked at the wall beside her bed. The wall covered in sticky notes, dozens of them, 3 years' worth of lunch messages from a father who loved her imperfectly and completely and every single day. Mom's not coming back, she said. Not with sadness, with clarity, the clarity of a child who'd processed something enormous and come out the other side with an understanding that most adults never reached. And I miss her. I'm always going to miss her, but missing somebody doesn't mean you have to miss everything else, too. He kissed her forehead. He turned off her light. He stood in the hallway and leaned against the wall and pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed. The dinner was on a Saturday, late June. Cleveland was finally warm, the kind of warm that made people forgive the city for its winters, and the restaurant's back windows were open to a small garden where Sal grew tomatoes and basil and complained about squirrels. Everyone arrived by 7. Marcus was wearing a tie, which meant he understood the gravity of the occasion, because Marcus wore ties to exactly 2 types of events, weddings and funerals. Diane brought flowers. Ethan's mother brought a casserole nobody had asked for because she was a Midwestern woman, and bringing unsolicited food to gatherings was a constitutional obligation. Vanessa came last. She was wearing a blue dress that Ethan had never seen before, and she'd left her hair down, which she rarely did in public, And when she came through the door and saw the table and the candles and the small group of people who looked at her without judgment or pity or calculation, just looked at her the way you look at someone who belongs, something shifted in her face, a softening, an unguarding. The mask she'd built over 7 years of public scrutiny, of magazine profiles and boardroom battles and comment sections in a world that couldn't decide whether to admire her or reduce her. That mask loosened, and the woman underneath it breathed. They ate. They talked. Sal brought out courses like a man on a mission, and Marcus told a story about Ethan as a teenager that involved a failed attempt to impress a girl with a homemade skateboard, and everyone laughed, and Vanessa's hand found Ethan's under the table the way it always did, slightly off-center, her thumb on his knuckle instead of the back of his hand. After dessert, tiramisu, homemade, slightly lopsided because Sal believed perfection was for people who didn't know how to cook, Ethan stood up. The table went quiet, not the anxious quiet of a boardroom, the expectant quiet of people who loved him and knew what was coming and wanted to be present for it. "A year ago," he said, and his voice was steady even though his hands weren't, "I sent a text message to the wrong person. I was sitting in my car in a parking garage with a broken heater, and I was exhausted, and I was scared, and I wrote down everything I was feeling because I thought nobody would ever see it except my brother. And then I hit send, and I watched it go to the most powerful person I'd ever met, and I was certain, absolutely certain, that I had just destroyed the only good thing in my life." He looked at Vanessa. She was looking back at him with those eyes, the ones that saw everything, the ones that made him feel like a complete person and not just a tired guy getting through the day. "I was wrong," he said. "That message didn't destroy anything. It started everything. Because you read it, and instead of firing me or pretending it didn't happen, you told me the truth. You told me that nobody had ever described you the way I did in that message. And I realized that we were the same. Two people who'd been invisible to the world in different ways, carrying different weight, building different walls, and somehow we'd found a crack in each other's defenses that let the light through." The table was very still. Diane was already crying. Marcus was gripping his wife's hand so hard her fingers were white. "I don't have a ring," Ethan said. "I thought about it. I looked at jewelry stores and catalogs and websites, and nothing felt right, because everything I looked at was trying to be impressive, and that's not what this is. This isn't about being impressive. This is about being real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, flat stone. Gray. Unremarkable. The stone from the dock at Seneca Lake, the one he'd picked up on the night he told her he loved her, the one Ava had placed on her nightstand and called the most interesting one. "I took this from a dock in New York on the night I told you the truth," he said. "It's not beautiful, it's not valuable, but it's real. It was there on the worst and best night of my life, and it's been in my daughter's room ever since, and she told me once that the best things aren't the prettiest. They're the most interesting. And you, Vanessa Laurent, are the most interesting person I have ever known." He knelt beside her wheelchair, not in front of her, beside her, at her level, eye to eye. "I'm not offering you a flashy life. I'm offering you a real one. Me and Ava, and a 2-bedroom apartment with a leaky ceiling and a car with a broken heater and off-brand cheese crackers and sticky notes on a lunchbox, and a family that isn't perfect but is honest and loyal, and ours. I'm offering you us, and I'm asking if that's enough." Vanessa looked at the stone in his hand. She looked at him. She looked at Ava, who was sitting between Marcus and Diane with her hands clasped under the table, her face bright and fierce and hopeful. "You have the worst timing of anyone I've ever met," Vanessa said. Her voice was wrecked, completely wrecked. Not the controlled strategic voice of a CEO or the guarded voice of a woman protecting herself or even the soft midnight voice she used in break rooms after 9 p.m. Just a voice. A human voice, shaking. "You sent me a love letter by accident. You told me you loved me on a freezing dock in the middle of winter, and now you're proposing to me with a rock in an Italian restaurant that smells like garlic. Is that a no?" "That is a yes, you impossible man. That is a yes." The table erupted. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked over his wine. Diane covered her face with both hands. Ethan's mother clutched her casserole like it was a life preserver. Daniel, who had once told Ethan he didn't want to watch another person get destroyed by loving Vanessa Laurent, raised his glass, and didn't say a word, because his eyes said everything. Ethan placed the stone in Vanessa's palm. She closed her fingers around it and pulled him toward her and kissed him, and it was clumsy because the angle was wrong and his knee was on the floor, and her wheelchair was in the way, and someone was clapping, and someone else was crying, and Sal was standing in the kitchen doorway wiping his hands on his apron and nodding like he'd seen this coming since the reservation was made. Ava waited until the noise died down. Then she walked over to them, carrying a rolled-up piece of paper she'd been hiding under her chair all night. She unrolled it and held it up, and the table went quiet again. It was a drawing. Crayon on white paper, the kind of art that only a 9-year-old can make. Rough and honest and unpolished and more true than anything a trained artist could produce. 3 figures. A tall man with brown hair. A woman in a wheelchair with a gold chain around her neck. A girl between them, smaller, holding both their hands. Above the figures, in handwriting that was careful and imperfect and absolutely certain, 2 words. Our family. Vanessa took the drawing. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at Ava. And then she did something Ethan had never seen her do in public, in front of people, with the mask off and the armor down, and nothing between her and the world but the truth. She cried. Not quietly, not strategically, the ugly kind, the real kind, the kind that comes from the basement of yourself. Ava, with the calm wisdom of a child who understood that tears weren't always about sadness, climbed into Vanessa's lap without asking and put her arms around her neck and said, "It's okay. You're ours now." The night ended the way the best nights do, not with a bang or a grand gesture or a cinematic moment that wraps everything up with a bow. It ended slowly. People said goodbye in the parking lot. Hugs lasted longer than usual. Marcus held Ethan for a full 10 seconds and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Diane kissed Vanessa's cheek and whispered something that made Vanessa close her eyes and nod. In the car, Vanessa's car, because Ethan's heater was still broken and would probably be broken forever. A running joke that had stopped being funny and become something better, a symbol, a shorthand for the life they were building, imperfect and real and stubbornly, defiantly theirs. Ava fell asleep in the back seat within 5 minutes, her head against the window. The drawing clutched in her lap, her breathing heavy and whistling the way it did when she slept hard. Ethan drove. Vanessa sat beside him, the stone still in her hand, her head tilted back against the seat, her eyes open and looking at nothing and everything. "Ethan," she said quietly, so as not to wake Ava. "Yeah." A year ago, I was sitting in my office at midnight reading a text message from a man I barely knew, and I thought, this is going to be a disaster. This is going to be complicated and painful and public, and every rational part of my brain is telling me to delete this message and pretend I never saw it. "Why didn't you?" "Because it was the first time in years that someone saw me, actually saw me, and I'd rather have the disaster than go back to being invisible." He reached over and took her hand. Off-center, as always, thumb on the knuckle. Imperfect. Theirs. The car moved through the Cleveland night, past the boarded-up storefronts and the coffee shop where Ethan had his first date with Claire, and the hospital where she'd closed her eyes for the last time. The city was a minefield of memories, and he drove through it with both hands on the wheel, and a woman beside him, and a child asleep in the back, and a rock in the center console that had started as a mistake on a dock, and become the foundation of something he didn't have a word for yet. Not a second chance. He didn't believe in second chances. He believed in the fact that life didn't stop when you wanted it to, and that pain didn't have an expiration date, and that love wasn't a replacement for loss. It was a separate thing entirely, growing in its own soil, on its own terms, asking nothing of the past except permission to exist. Claire was gone. She would always be gone. And the grief would always be there, a permanent resident in that space behind his ribs, paying rent he'd never asked for. But the space was bigger than he'd thought. There was room for grief and love and fear and hope, and a 9-year-old who sorted rocks by luster, and a woman who ran an empire from a wheelchair, and a brother who wore ties to important occasions, and a car with a broken heater that somehow still got them where they needed to go. People spend their lives waiting for happiness to arrive. A promotion, a windfall, a person, a moment that flips the switch and turns the lights on. Ethan had waited too. For 3 years, he'd waited in the dark, convinced that the lights had gone out permanently when Claire died, that the best parts of his life were behind him and everything ahead was just management, managing grief, managing bills, managing a child's expectations about a world that kept taking things from her. But happiness hadn't arrived. It hadn't shown up at his door with a bow on it. It had accumulated, slowly, messily, in stolen conversations and burned garlic bread and a text message sent to the wrong person at the wrong time that turned out to be exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. It had built itself out of imperfect materials, a leaky ceiling, a broken heater, a secondhand couch, a woman who couldn't walk and a man who'd forgotten how to feel, and a child who collected rocks because she understood, better than any adult, that the most interesting things were never the prettiest. He pulled into the apartment parking lot. He turned off the engine. The car ticked in the silence. Ava breathed. Vanessa's hand was still in his. "We're home," he said. Vanessa looked at the building, the unremarkable, slightly run-down two-bedroom apartment building in Cleveland, Ohio, with its flickering streetlight and its cracked sidewalk and its absolute lack of anything that resembled the world she came from. "Yeah," she said. "We are." He carried Ava upstairs. She didn't wake, just folded against his shoulder the way she'd done since she was a baby, boneless and trusting, her weight a familiar comfort. Vanessa came up in the elevator and met them at the door, and Ethan carried Ava to her bed and removed her shoes and pulled the covers up and put the drawing on the nightstand next to the dock rock and the growing collection of specimens and the wall of sticky notes that stretched from the headboard to the window. He stood in the doorway for a moment. His daughter slept. The faucet dripped. The streetlight flickered outside. Behind him, Vanessa waited in the living room, holding a stone that was worth nothing and meant everything. And outside the window, Cleveland kept being Cleveland, flawed, stubborn, cold in winter, and grudgingly beautiful in summer. A city that never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Ethan Walker was 32 years old. He was a single father. He was a designer. He was a man who'd lost everything and sat in the wreckage for 3 years and then, without planning it, without deserving it, without doing anything more remarkable than telling the truth at the wrong time to the wrong person, he'd stumbled into something that felt like the future. Not the future he'd planned, not the future he'd lost. A different one. Rougher, stranger, harder to explain. A future built on accident and honesty and the stubborn refusal of two broken people to stay broken alone. He turned off Ava's light. He walked to the living room. Vanessa was on the couch, her shoes off, the blanket Ava always draped over her already across her lap. She looked up when he came in. "Come sit down," she said. "Your kid drools in her sleep, by the way." "She gets that from me." "I know. I've seen your desk after a late night." He sat beside her. The couch creaked. The apartment settled around them, small and warm and full of everything that mattered. Happiness didn't disappear with his old life. It was waiting for him at the end of a road he almost didn't keep walking. But he did. He kept walking. And here, in a two-bedroom apartment with a dripping faucet and a secondhand couch and a sleeping child and a woman who saw him, really saw him, the broken parts and the messy parts, and the parts he was ashamed of, he finally understood that the road doesn't end when you lose someone. It just turns. And if you're brave enough to follow it, if you're stubborn enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when the ground is cracked and the heater is broken and you can't see what's ahead, sometimes it takes you somewhere you never expected, somewhere that feels like home.